Well, good morning and welcome again to another lesson from the theme of Proverbs. We've did an introduction last week, and today we want to look at Solomon's request for wisdom. And we'll be also exploring a few of the Proverbs that are in first three chapters today. But we do want to spend a little bit of time talking about Solomon's method that occurred as he looked for wisdom, and we'll see how that played out and how God responded to that. Before we begin, let's start again, as always, with a prayer. Dear Father, glorious Father, you're just awesome. The knowledge of the things that you have placed around us is awesome. The ability to understand a few of them, you grant to us, we thank you. We ask that you help us with our understanding of your ways. Help us to have a heart that's the heart that you want us to have. We ask your blessings as far as people that are struggling with the issues of their life. Thank you for watching and caring for us. And we ask a special blessing on the lesson today. May it reveal some of the very depths of the things that are going on that you want us to have in our lives. These things we ask, Father, in the name of Jesus. Amen. Well, last week, here's a quick summary of what we talked about. We saw that Solomon had a large group of sayings, very prolific, over 3,000 of them. And there were over 1,000 songs that were identified as coming from him. And these sayings were intended for practical use. And Solomon very quickly said the key to understanding wisdom and knowledge and things like that is the reverence for God. And in fact, the things of this earth, such as knowledge and relationships and situations and decisions and theories and things like that, all of them require a lot of wisdom on how to deal with them. And Solomon says that the beginning of all of that, understanding all of those kinds of things to the degree that you can, starts with our understanding and reverence from the Lord. In fact, verse 7 says it this way, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And said in another way, if we make it our first priority to know the Creator, then we'll understand the things of creation even better. And so that's where we see Solomon addressing this issue of knowledge in our lesson today. In our lesson, we'll see that in Solomon's request for wisdom, it first starts with a conflict of the transition from one leadership, that of David, to Solomon. And if you don't understand the conflict of transition from one regime to another, well, just stick around the next couple of months, because when it's election time, these kinds of issues always come to the surface. Well, David then confirms Solomon as who the true king really is. And then God gives Solomon an unlimited offer. Solomon's request to that offer is, we'll look at that, and then finally God's response. Then we'll look at a few of the Proverbs to begin with. All right, let's look at this transition from the second king of Israel to the third king of Israel. David, at this time in his life, is on his deathbed. He's been the king for 40 years, and now he is an old man, and he is struggling with his health. And finally, at the last, people realize from Psalms 132 and Psalms 89 where it says that one of David's offspring will inherit the throne. Well, if we look at the offspring of David, his first son was Ammon, and then it was Gilead, and Absalom, Adonijah, and then Solomon. Well, both Ammon and Absalom have been killed in battle at this time. Bible doesn't say what the status is of Gilead at this time, but he seems to be a non-entity if he's around. If not, well, it just doesn't say. And so Adonijah does consider himself then the next in line, and so he decides to make himself king. In fact, the Bible says that he exalted himself. And he then throws a banquet just outside the outskirts of Jerusalem, and he declares himself king. He invites all of his brothers except one, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and a few other people, and they have this big banquet. He declares himself king, and there's a lot of excitement going on around that. The people that were not invited to this banquet, they were Nathan, who was the prophet, Zadok, who was a priest, and Solomon, one of the sons, the only son evidently that was not invited, and so these were excluded. Well, when Nathan hears about the fact that these people were not invited, he tells Bathsheba, he said, if you want to preserve the life of Solomon and yourself, we need to go talk to David, because David does not plan on Adonijah being the king. Solomon is really the true king. And so Nathan and Bathsheba then go and tell David. And David then specifically identifies Solomon as who he wants to have and who God wants to have as the true king, the next king of Israel. In fact, David makes this point. Behold, and this is from 1 Chronicles, behold, a son will be born to you. So this is something now that God told David even before Solomon was born. Behold, a son will be born to you who shall be a man of rest, and I'll give him rest from all his enemies on every side. For his name shall be Solomon, which means peaceful, Shalom, Solomon. His name shall be Solomon, and I will give him peace and quiet to Israel in his days. David understood that the Lord had the intention to make Solomon the next king. So now that Adonijah has made himself king, there is a conflict going on. So David, all this is now happening in Jerusalem. So David tells Nathan and Zadok that you need to take Solomon down to Gihon, which is just outside the city gates. It was a place where the city got a lot of their water. There were some springs there. And hold the coronation of Solomon as the third king of Israel. Hold it there. And so David instructs them to take his servants and to take David's mule and let Solomon ride on his mule. Well, we kind of think that's a little funny about Solomon riding on a mule. All of our heroes that we're familiar with rode horses. You remember Roy Rogers, don't you, Travis? Travis is shaking his head no. Youth. Well, Roy Rogers' horse, king of the cowboys, his horse was Trigger. Gene Autry's horse was Champion. Hopalong's horse was Topper. All of these people rode horses. The only person that I know that rode a mule during the cowboy days in Gunsmoke was Festus, and his mule was named Ruth. Well, here is Solomon riding David's mule, and horses were used in war. They were known as war horses. Mules were also used for nobility. If you rode on a colt, such as what Jesus did, a donkey, coming in on the streets there right before the crucifixion, that weekend, it was a sign of peace. Well, here is the nobility of a king riding in on a mule. And so they go to Gihon. Solomon is crowned king there. Oil is poured on his head. And then he goes back to Jerusalem. Well, when that happens, and there's all kinds of revelry going on, there's all kinds of excitement. The trumpets are being played. Flute players are there. People are rejoicing all around Solomon at this point in time. Well, that noise gets over to Adonijah's party, and he finds out that David has confirmed that Solomon is the true king. Adonijah's guests, they all flee, and Adonijah now feels like he's the one whose life is at risk, and so he runs to where the altar is, and he holds on to the horns of the altar and fears for his life. Turns out several people in the Bible, when they would be in trouble, they would run to the altar and hold on to the horns. That was a place of refuge. It was like, in a way, the cities of refuge, that if you did that, you were excluded from being any harm. Well, Solomon finds out that Adonijah's there. He goes and tells Adonijah, you don't have to worry about your life, just be worthy in the way that you live. And so he spared at that time Adonijah's life. At that time, they leave from Jerusalem and they go up to Gibeon. And there Solomon is going to do a lot of sacrificing. Now Gibeon is where the ark or the tabernacle is located. When Moses came out of Egypt and Joshua finally stationed the tabernacle, they stationed it in Shiloh. And at Shiloh, it stayed there for many, many years. At one time, the Philistines came over and they take over the city of Shiloh. The tabernacle is now moved to Gibeon, and so that's where it is. But David has now moved the Ark of the Covenant, and placed it in a tent in the Jerusalem area. So the Ark is in Jerusalem, but everything else about the tabernacle is there in Gibeon. And so that's where Solomon goes to do all these sacrificing. And so he goes to Gibeon and does sacrificing. And it's at this point and at this time that the Lord says to Solomon in a dream, ask what you wish me to give you. What do you want me to give you, Solomon? And here is Solomon's reply. Then Solomon said, you have shown great loving kindness to your servant David, my father, according as he walked before you in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart toward you. And you have reserved for him this great loving kindness, that you have given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day. Let's look at that. Quite a statement for a young man. First off, he starts with honor, thanksgiving, and respect for God. He talks about the fact that God had shown great loving kindness to his servant David, Solomon's father. And then he goes on to say, and you have reserved for him, for David, this great loving kindness. And he's talking now about God willing to extend David's legacy through his family. He said, you have reserved for him this great loving kindness, that you have given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day. Solomon continues. He says, now, O Lord, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, talking about himself. Yet I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or to come in. Your servant is in the midst of your people, which you have chosen, a great people, who are too many to be numbered or counted. He first starts out and he says, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father. This is a gift from God. Remember last week, 1 Corinthians 4? What do you have that wasn't given you? And then he says, I don't know how to go out or to come in. I'm but a little child. We see the humility of Solomon at this point. Now he says, I'm but a little child. I've looked up the age that Solomon could have been. The earliest and the youngest age that I found was 12, and the oldest was 20. So he's somewhere between this. Josephus said he was 14. A lot of the commentators believe he's maybe toward 20. Whatever it is, he is a young man. And he feels very inadequate. He said, your servant is in the midst of your people, which you have chosen, a great people who are too many to be numbered or to be counted. He's saying, this is a daunting task. This is an awesome task. And I feel like a little child. I don't know how to handle it. I don't know how to go out. I don't know how to come in. And then he says, so, consequently, so give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? David now at this point asks for wisdom and insight. Give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. And at the last, he basically says, only you are able to judge a group of people as magnificent and as awesome and as large as this. Only you. The next verse says these words. This is God talking back to Solomon. Because you didn't ask for, and here's three things now, Travis, that David didn't ask for. Let's see if you can come up with what they are. Here's a picture of the first one. A long life, exactly. And then the next thing that Solomon did not ask for was this, a blank check. He did not ask for riches for himself. And the third thing was, and here we have in the background a city that is on fire. We have captives being carried out. And the third thing he didn't ask for was the life of his enemies. God said, because you didn't ask for these things, and that's probably the kind of things that a typical young man would ask for. Money, riches, today a new car, a good job, whatever. But Solomon, I think, even though he's young, is feeling the intense responsibility of such a daunting task. Because you didn't ask for that, well, let's back up, hold it. And that is, what does this tell us about Solomon? Number one, he recognized and accepted the task. He realized that he was a servant. Even though he'd be titled a king, he recognized he was a servant. And he realized that they weren't his people, that they were the people of God, somebody else's nation, a great nation. And he also knew who he was. He knew that he was but a little child, barely capable of getting around. And so he humbly then asked for wisdom. God continued with his response. Because you didn't ask those things, behold, I have given you a wise and discerning heart, so that there has been no one like you before you, nor shall one like you arise after you. I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there will not be any among the kings like you all your days. David had a prayer for his son. Not sure when it was given, but it was early on. It was this: give the king your judgments, O God, and he's talking about himself, and your righteousness to the king's son. May he judge your people with righteousness, and your afflicted with justice. Let the mountains bring peace to the people, and the hills in righteousness. May he vindicate the afflicted of the people, save the children of the needy, and crush the oppressor. This is in Psalm 72. So it was a prayer about Solomon from David. And then also in Psalm 127 it says, unless, and this was written now by Solomon, unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchman keeps awake in vain. I hope you've been watching the devotionals that Wes has out each morning. Last week, one of the devotions was centered around this chapter. If you haven't seen it, go back and look. It's entitled, Unless the Lord Builds the House. It's about 15 minutes long. An excellent devotional centered around this, written by Solomon. So Solomon says, unless you provide the wisdom, I am not capable to be the king of Israel. So, remember Solomon last week said the beginning of knowledge is the fear of the Lord? That you have the respect, the honor, and the reverence and the worship for God. That is where you begin. Well, we see that Solomon actually practiced what he preached. He understood that, and he started that very way himself. And we see as a result the very peak of Israel's popularity, that the zenith of the prosperity and the peace and the world influence was during Solomon's time, just like God said it would be. Well, let's look now at some lessons from Proverbs. Okay, here is a picture, and I want you to tell me what you see in this picture. Well, there's a young girl, right? And she is evidently flying probably a kite. And the day looks to be a very bright and wonderful day. The experience seems to be a good one because notice her face, the expression. She's got a smile on her face. And so we see a young girl flying a kite, having a good time. Well, if we expand the picture, now what do you see? Well, you see maybe a father teaching his child how to fly a kite. And there's so many lessons that we could make on this. We won't go into them, but it's like wisdom handling a situation. The father being the wisdom and the situation of flying the kite as the activity itself. Or it can be a father teaching a child how to do something. Or it could be the bonding of a parent to a son or to a daughter. And so we see here a picture of the very thing that Solomon is going to say in verse 8. In verse 7, he said, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge and wisdom. And that's where you begin. The very next thing that he says is important is this. Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. God is number one, and parents are number two in this search for wisdom and for knowledge. Parents are the core teacher of the foundations of life. And the fathers teach some things that mothers cannot teach. And mothers teach things that fathers can't teach. And sometimes the roles are indeed reversed or whatever. but they each have a place in the education of their kids. Now, if we were in a class right now, here is where we would put the class to work. And I would say, what things are taught early on in a home? And here are the three. If I said, what are the three top things, a class would come up with 4 or 5. They always do. That's why class is so good. And so one of the first things is said, and so different people, psychiatrists, sociologists, all talk about this, and that is the establishment of moral values are learned very early in life at home. And then also the social behavior of how to get along with different people, and how to get along in family, how to get along when there's struggles. All of that is learned. Now, even at this time in our life, with what's going on in our life now, we've had to learn some new social behaviors. I don't know how many times, and I did it today. I get out of the truck and go into the restaurant, and I see the sign on the door, you need the mask, and I know this, and I go back to the truck and I get the mask and I go in. And we keep our 6-foot distance, and we have a whole new world of social behavior now that we're not really used to. After 5 months, it's becoming a little bit like normal, but it's not normal, quite honestly. These are 2 things that are learned at home. Now, the third thing that is learned at home is the identification of individual skills and gifts. When the good Lord blesses a mother and father with children, it is indeed a blessing in itself. In fact, God calls it a reward. These are rewards. But you don't know who your kid is when they're born. You can look at them and they've got all of the parts, but you don't know who they are, and neither do they. And so in the early years, one of the most enjoyable things that a parent does is helping the child discover what his talents, what her skills, what their gifts are in their life. And this is something that not only parents can do, and grandparents can do it as well. And that is to help the child discover just basically who they are, what their likes are, what their dislikes are. And in fact, when we were raising our 2 boys, one of the things that my wife and I, we wanted to do, we wanted to be the ones that introduced our kids to life. Every new experience, we wanted to be the ones that did it the first time. The first time that we went to a fire station and saw the big red fire engine. The first time they rode a bicycle. The first time they went camping. The first time they went fishing. All of these things, we wanted to be the one to introduce them to that. And then we'd watch and see whether they enjoyed that or not. And grandparents can be just as much. This is the first 2 items of moral values and social behavior. Well, that's kind of technical things that you do. But this identification of individual skills and gifts, this is where grandparents can just spoil the kids. And you don't have to worry about it. All you have to do is say, we're just trying to find out who this kid is. And so we're doing a lot of things for them, and let's see how they react. And so you can spoil them. This is a wonderful thing to do. When our grandkids would come see us, when they were 9, 10 years old, I would always have a project for them, a project for them to do. One of the projects was to make a pen for their mom and their dad. So Cooper made a pen for our mom, and Chase made a pen for his dad. And so we'd go out to the shop and take a piece of wood and turn the wood on a lathe and put the pieces together, and they would do that. When we got through, my granddaughter said, "Can I make one for myself?" Well, I mean, that's saying yes to a granddad, and granddad yes to the child. And so we make a pen for her. For the next day and a half, she spent writing a story with this pen. I mean, she was intense. And I'm thinking, maybe we've got a writer here. Well, as a teenager, she's now into horses. And it may be something else. But you have to go through these experiences to find out who the child is. Do they like doing this? Do they like doing that? The next year when they came, we made cigar box guitars. And you can buy all the pieces together and you put them together and they can paint them any color that they want. And these cigar box guitars, they actually work. The Beatles actually recorded one song using a cigar box guitar. It turns out, I said, okay, now when your parents come to pick you up, we can have a concert and you can play a song and we'll do Mary Had a Little Lamb. And one of you can do the strumming and the other one pick out the melody. And turns out for about 3 days we practiced and it was a lot of fun and it was a lot of work at night. Before they'd go to bed, we'd have a practice session. On the night before the parents were to come, we had our practice session, and after it was over, little Cooper was the youngest, was storming up the stairs, and you could tell she was a little disgruntled. And Xander asked her, Cooper, what's wrong? And she said, Granddad is pushing my limits. Well, what's a grandfather to be? That's what he does. So we pushed the limits, and they did great. So there would be examples of things that we did with our kids, like I didn't know how to fly, but I know how to make that happen. And so we'd take our kids up for airplane flight, and we wanted to be there first. And so this is a wonderful thing. But these are things that are learned early in life that help shape a child. Look at these sayings. Here are things that I found. Aristotle said, give me a child until he's 7, and I'll show you the man. Lenin, one of the leaders of Russia, says, give me 4 years to teach the children, and the seed I have sown will never be uprooted. One of the publications made this statement, first 5 years have a direct impact on how a child develops. One last one, as the twig is bent, so grows the tree. I tried to find out who said that, and I could not, but I do know that I heard my dad say it many times. So, the importance of the family. You start with God, and the fear of God helps us understand the knowledge and wisdom, and the next thing is the role that the parents play for shaping the child. Continuing on after verse 8 to verse 9, it says, indeed, these things, there are a graceful wreath to your head and ornaments about your neck. And it says, my son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. Well, who's going to teach them who sinners are? Who's going to teach them what right and wrong is? Well, that comes back to the role of the parents. And so this is a very important thing, and that is it's the parents that teaches these very fundamental issues of life. And remember what it says in Deuteronomy, as you walk along the way, when you rise up in the morning, when you go to bed at night, it's a continual process. Here is an example of that. And it's in Proverbs, the first chapter, verse 11 through 19, and the whole concept says, don't be fooled by the enticement and promises of sinners. You know, if you take a child fishing and you go out there and you can have a wonderful experience, there's something significant that can be taught. And that is the lure of the bait and how it's actually fake and it doesn't really represent a true it represents a true piece of bait that the fish would like, but it is just a trick to get the fish to bite. And that's exactly what sinners tell people. Let's go do this. And that is just a lure to do wrong. And you can make that kind of instruction. You can teach that concept right there while you're having a good time with your child. And you use verses like what's in Hebrews 11, the passing pleasures of sin. Sin is fun, but it doesn't last. And so if we teach these things early on, then we're not as surprised later on. Here's another one. It says, he is a shield, speaking of God, he is a shield to those who walk in integrity. When you do the right thing, there's a shield about you. I know a young man, just got his driver's license, 16 years of age. With that, he decided he would get a job, and so he did. And so he was running some errands for a person, and as he's driving and fulfilling this particular errand, he backs up and hits a fence and knocks some of the stones out of a rock wall. Several things you can do at a time like this. You can just drive off, or you can put the stones back best you can and drive off, or you can put the stones back and call the owner. Well, this 16-year-old did the last. He put the stones back, called the owner, said, I'm sorry, I backed up, I hit your fence, and I knocked some rocks off. And the owner said, don't worry about it, thanks for calling. And there was a shield around this young man because he took the high road. You say, well, what happens if the owner had blown his top and gotten really mad? The shield is still there, and that shield is you know in your heart that you've done the right thing. You confessed the problem. You made it known, willing to repair it, all of these things, and so you can still stand strong in the face of God, and that is a shield in itself. Honor the Lord. Here's another proverb. This is in the 3rd chapter. Honor the Lord from your wealth and from the first of your produce. Well, this comes back even from the early days of Israel, right after they have been, right after they've made their exit out of Egypt. And here was the instruction. You shall bring the first, the very first of the first fruits. So the first of the first fruits of your soil into the house of the Lord. Now think of this. You've gone through the winter. You've probably used up most of the food that you have. And now here you have the blessings of a crop that is just coming out, and you take the first of the harvest, the very first part of the first of the harvest. And God says, I want you to give that to me. I want you to sacrifice that. And by doing that, what you're saying is, this statement is a statement of trust and of thanks that I believe you will take care of me, and I'm taking the first part and giving it to you, and I'm at this point still have nothing, but I believe you will take care of me. And so the instruction is, honor the Lord from your wealth, from the first of your produce. And that's whether grapes or whether olives from the olive tree or from your flock or from whatever it is. The Lord indeed will provide. Here's another one, 3rd chapter. Don't reject the discipline of the Lord or loathe his reproof. For whom the Lord loves, he disciplines. This is also found in the 12th chapter. It's quoted again in the 12th chapter of Hebrews. I remember the first time I saw this verse, I was older in life. And one of the verses in Hebrews says that God disciplines and scourges every son he receives. And I thought, I don't remember God ever disciplining me. And I got to thinking, maybe he did and I didn't see it. One of the important things that I think grandparents can teach their kids and their kids' kids is this, of how God reveals himself to us in everyday life and the ways that God disciplines us in our life. And this word discipline is not necessarily a spanking or or harsh treatment. It's like coaching. It's like instructing on how to do it better. Because what happens is, in things like this, in situations like this, there is something that's going on behind the scenes of life. God's doing something. And so often in the Old Testament, we see what that finally was. For example, what was going on with Joseph when he was thrown in the pit, winds up down in Egypt. Turns out God meant it for good. But in this whole process, if you look at it, it looks just like normal events, but something's going on behind the scenes. Older people who have seen these kinds of things in their own life can teach these to their kids and especially to their grandkids. So early on in life, they recognize how God is dealing with them in the various stages of their life. Here's another one. Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due, when it is in your power to do it. Don't say to your neighbor, go and come back tomorrow and I'll give it to you, when you have it with you. The whole point is, God tells us to be ready to do something. Look at, there's probably not a better illustration of this than the Good Samaritan, the story of the Good Samaritan. Here you have the Levite and the priest. They come by, they're just too busy. They've got something else to do. God says to be ready. I looked up some be ready verses in the New Testament. And they are this. Timothy was told to be ready to share. He was also told to be ready no matter what the season is, in season, out of season, with your teaching. Instruction to Titus is to be ready for every good deed. Peter tells us to be ready to give an answer for the hope that we have. So all these things are things to take the initiative, to be ready to share, to do something good, to watch that. I was driving down the road one day, and there was a lady, older lady, parked along the side of the road. The hood was up to her car, so she was having car trouble. I go past, I turn around, come back. Well, it turns out there's a pickup in front of me that's doing the same thing. So he's a little bit ahead of me. We both park over there. This cowboy gets out. I know he's a cowboy because he had a belt buckle about the size of a garbage pail lid. And it was very, very significant. And his cowboy hat and his boots and everything. Well, together we decide that it's a battery problem, and it's just a loose connection. We clean it up, everything's fine. And she says to us, what do I owe you? Well, I learned something that day. It's a combination of the discipline of the Lord and also being ready to do something. And that is, my reply was going to be, oh, don't worry about it. We're glad to stop. You're very welcome, which is true. But the cowboy had a better answer. He had a lot better answer. And he said, I couldn't take anything, ma'am. Said my master, he wouldn't like it. So just say thanks and say thank you, Lord, for the blessing. And I thought, that is a much better answer than what I planned. And so while we both were doing it for the same reason, turns out he had a little bit more glory to the Lord than what I was going to say. I missed an opportunity for that. So there's learning times and blessings all through our life as we help people discover, especially little kids, their lives and what it's about. So, summary of our lesson today is this. Number one, Adonijah said, my plan didn't work. He exalted himself. In contrast, Solomon humbled himself. And Solomon followed the very thing that he said, and that is, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. He did that for many years. At the end of his life, he began to lose focus. And we'll talk about that probably later on. And finally, reverence to God and the role of the family. Reverence to God and the role of the family and the diligence in teaching and discovering and helping kids learn who they are the very foundations for wise living. Well, that's our lesson for today. Hope it gives you some ideas on how to apply these things to your own life. May you be blessed this week and look for the ways in which the Lord is working and dealing and counseling and coaching and guiding you and your kids and your grandkids. God bless.